So start off, this topic, open source, that pretty heavily loaded discussion if you just say open source. But, open source, I didn't realize this. I did some research yesterday and realized it's 20 plus years old. 1998 was when it was coined, the term, and accepted, but 20 plus years old. And I remember the early days that like nobody's going to do open source. Who's going to trust somebody out there developing my software for me, and what kind of bugs and backdoors and everything and security issues are going to happen? Now we don't even talk about that, right? That's not even a conversation. Open source is literally part of technology's DNA today, right? And part of an everyday way of life for development and software we run. So it's not really discussing whether it should be used now. There's more of a focus, getting to this maturity is scaling it, its use, the life cycle of development, its sustainability, and those kind of issues. And also really having the profound impact it is on trending technologies like AI and ML as an example. And so with that, I thought one of the things we could talk about, while this term has been around a while, intersourcing really has started to become, a real big discussion. I know even within TIBCO, some of the projects we do, that's an intersourcing approach that we're using, a combination of open source to develop things. And so I thought we'd just start talking about that. Really, how important is this today, this approach?
Yeah, I mean, intersourcing is almost like an evolution of the open sourcing. Some of the trends that we're seeing in that particular area. I actually should back up a little bit, I guess. I mean, for folks that maybe have not run into that term yet, intersourcing in many ways is applying a lot of the techniques that are used in the open source world to software development within an enterprise. And that doesn't matter if you're a software company, it's just in general applying some of those techniques to the enterprise. So as you're building software, as you're building applications and so on, you're taking more of a open source approach, but not necessarily exposing the software to the outside world, but you're applying many of the techniques to the way in which you build software internally. And I get asked the question, oh, why? I put all my code in a private GitHub repository or GitLab or something like that. That means I'm intersourcing, right? It's like, no, right? So it's actually more around the idea of collaboration. It's around the idea of building a different culture. It's around the idea of trying to prevent silos in terms of developing software, promote more reuse. There's a number of elements that are being brought from the open source world and applying that into what the enterprise does and how they develop software. So it has been interesting. We definitely have seen a trend towards this purely because of the benefits that, as you mentioned, have been shown in the open source community.
Yeah, and I know Stacey in our conversation, go ahead, JC, you're going to say something.
I would add, really speaking from a software supply chain assurance and security and risk management perspective, back in the day when we were all dividing things into open source versus proprietary, back when that was the dichotomy, people said, well, something's more secure if it's open source, right? Because many eyes makes the bug shallow. And I think what we've come to find as open source has proliferated is that it's not more secure because it's open source. There's plenty of insecure open source. Software is more secure when it's well maintained. And so if you have a choice, you want well-maintained open source, right? That's the best. Well-maintained corporate code, second best. Ill-maintained open source, at least you can look at. You have transparency. And ill-maintained proprietary closed source, that's the worst. And so part of the promise of Intersource is to actually start to throw some light on things like active maintenance and have these components been touched in the last year, right? Is someone actually remediating vulnerabilities on a rolling basis? And I think that it forces organizations to designate what's really important to them, because unmaintained code is insecure. It always will be. So we have limited resources and we have to choose, right? Which projects dependencies are we going to bump, right? What are we going to assure? Where the people go? Because there's a lot of work associated with the active maintenance that maintains security. And so this is the well-maintained versus badly maintained, I think, is really the new dichotomy in software supply chain assurance. And you can see indicators of that in things like the recent executive order.
Yeah, and one of the topics I have more, so we're just starting to touch that one. I know this is a long topic, which you touched on in resiliency of open source. So we're going to get to that one for sure. And I do want to, Stacey, want to hear what you have to say, because I know open intersourcing has really been vital and is key part of what's going on at Intel.
Yeah, it is, and it's important. We're just starting that journey though, and we did have to learn from our open source initiatives how to collaborate inside. That seems backwards that we learned how to collaborate outside of the company before we learned how to collaborate inside the company. I don't know we're that unique in that problem, but that's the problem that we were trying to solve, is how what JC said is, how do we make sure that we have well-maintained code and we have assigned maintainers for that code? And then how do we make sure that we set up an easy way to move code from one group to another and to collaborate on that code? And in large organizations, I think that a lot of times that's missing. It was for us. We're on the journey to fix that, but we are just starting that journey. So, stay tuned for what we learn from it and how it helps us. But we are pretty optimistic that it will help us.
Yeah, that's great. And Michael, I know in many of the projects you do, especially, data science is such a big area across TIBCO. And, that's your team's focus on the data scientists we have at TIBCO. But the analytics area, data science touches everything. And I'm sure you're seeing a lot of this in how we approach, a lot of our software and even some of the projects you're working on.
No, absolutely. We use the practices of open source, but we're also actively collaborating on projects that extend our products with open source code. So we have a initiative inside our analytics area, Spotfire Mods, which is a extensible collection of graphics to the inbuilt graphics palette. And so we have a number of folks internally in my team and even with our customers collaborating on developing additional visualizations that can be added into Spotfire. And we're going in the same code base. We're using the same, collaborative techniques that an open source project uses to, build those new visualizations. We also have a project, Python data function library for some of our products, where multiple of our internal data scientists and developers are in there contributing to a Python project that does feature engineering and and machine learning type methodologies that we're adding into, our products. We're big users of Spark in our data science product, and we're building a set of custom operators or mods on our data science product. Again, there's multiple people on my team contributing to that and developing it and testing it. So we have at least 3 internal repositories just in our team at TIBCO where we're providing open source additions, to our products. And we've even Python's got such a friendly, commercial language. We've been able to embed it in our products and do these extensions without a problem. With R, it had a less friendly license. So we actually rewrote an R interpreter in our team that we could embed in our product. And then we had a similar open source style internal project to create R functions that were extensions of that. So our visual analytics and data science products have R and Python engines inside of them, one written by TIBCO, one open source Python, that we are actively collaborating internally at TIBCO to make contributions to extend our functionality of our analytics products, whether it's visual analytics or data science. So we're fully on board and embracing the inner source idea, I think, across all of those projects.
Yeah, and I think that you really touched on something there. In fact, a question came across that's kind of germane to this. That collaboration is really key. We, even at TIBCO, right, we tend to run our products a lot in silos, and even within TIBCO Labs, Nelson, we're working across different parts of the organization in how you're working together. So one of the questions that came through here was, how do you ensure that the code version control is maintained when there are multiple development threads with Intersource? So anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, I think it starts with assigning a maintainer. It starts with just assigning somebody and saying, you are the maintainer, here's how you're supposed to behave, and then holding them accountable. So I think that's one way.
Yeah, I
know-
mean, strict
Go
rules
ahead, go ahead, Nelson. Go ahead.
strict
Or
rules
whoever's
for how
gonna
to
go, you
check in and do a build and stuff like that. I mean, you have to have strict processes around just the mechanics of it.
Exactly. Yeah, the
Yeah,
process.
I think one of the considerations here is that Intersource doesn't mean it's a free for all, and now no one has any rules or guidelines, or
Right.
none of them are working towards an overall architecture or a design. Or you still have that. It's very similar in the open source community. You have people that are really setting the direction of the open source project. That's again not a free for all either. I mean, a lot of the open source projects that are heavily adopted and hopefully well maintained, JC's point, they have to manage versions. They have to. I mean, it's that aspect of it does not change with intersourcing. And so for intersourcing, it's very similar in that the sense you'll still have an owner of the particular project. It's just now you have more transparency into that code. So it's not just owned by one group. It's now transparent across the organization. You can have more contributors or more eyes on the code, and then promote that level of reuse. And so a lot of the same concepts will still apply. Intersource is just, it's not a free-for-all inside an organization's firewalls.
Yeah, and you guys both key, everybody key on this. And Nelson, I am obviously thinking about, the projects we have around smart apps, and, we have it's very heavily open source, intersourced. And since the program was new, one of the things we stepped back and took a lot of time before we did any development was making sure we had the appropriate processes to maintain what we were building and make sure that would scale. So I agree, having that collaboration continues on a process perspective across all those threads.
Yeah,
that's really important.
And I would add that there's also it adds this level of, for the people who want to upstream their code, for the groups that want to upstream their code, they have to then go, and there is a process for them to go in and explain to the technical steering committee and others of why their code should be accepted and upstreamed into the main trunk. And so that's something that I think that process is really important as well when we talk about well-maintained code.
Yeah, you'll still have reviewers. I mean, a lot of those things do still exist. And Stacey, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, a large part of this is not even a technical problem. And Greg, you alluded to it as well. It's more to do with the processes that you put into place and the cultural shift and organizational changes that you have to make. Even the way that developers in some organizations and enterprises are measured, that changes. Mm-hmm. Right? As a developer now, I normally, in some organizations, right, they write their code, and if they own that code and no one else knows how that code works, that's how they perceive that's their value to the organization. Conversely, if you take an intersourcing approach, it's much more around collaboration, and it's also around things like mentorship. So how do you change the model by which developers are, quote unquote, measured, if part of their day job is now to mentor new people that are coming in, which in theory should be easier because it is much more open and the documentation is all there, it's part of the project and so on. So there's a number of different facets to this that actually have nothing to do with the technology.
Yeah. And there's a lot of institutional dynamics. I mean, one of the things that we do at Ion Channel is monitor maintenance histories of thousands of components and projects. And we can tell who maintains their code and who doesn't. And there's some selection there, but the problem in organizations is generally the people who get rewarded are the ones who are the loudest talkers, and they create the most MVPs, and they're super sizzling hot, and their demo looks amazing, and they get the resources. Those people generally do not maintain their code. Right. They want to do new things. They want to do fun things. Right. They don't want to actually keep something secure. So we're being breached through all this sizzle. And part of the promise of actually measuring the time to remediation, which we'll go ahead and automate, rack and stack, is you can see who are the NASCAR pit crews in your organization, where when there's a critical vulnerability that pops up, these guys have it done in 2 hours. You want to take all the money from the people who don't maintain their capabilities and give it to the people who maintain their capabilities. And the instrumentation of that makes that possible. So the people who come up with the fantastic ideas, they can go and contribute ideas, but these are not folks you want sitting on ownership of enterprise capabilities, because the attack landscape is just too sharp.
Yeah, at that point, JC, I think that it's important to have that there are, we have to do both. We have to have teams that go after the sizzle, and we have to have those NASCAR teams that are maintaining. But there's a process for incubation. And I think that's something that we need to look at a little bit more seriously in the innovation space, is what does that incubation process look like? And at what point should code graduate, if you will, into a maintenance approach in a wider scale implementation? And I'm not convinced that we've figured that out yet as a ecosystem, as an innovation ecosystem. But there is a challenge there I think we have to address.
Yeah, that is true. Bridging that gap is a challenge. When does innovation never stops. So when does that one project reach a level of maturity that it now goes into a different phase of its life, if you will? And you know, that is likely a different team with different characteristics. And so, yeah, when and how do you make that transition? I agree, that can be very difficult. Yes. Yeah, I mean, JC,
who are really comfortable in that generative idea space, and they just want to work in the labs and come up with these new things, but they then also have to be able to like give away their baby, right, to the people who are going to raise the baby and send the baby to college.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we actually build my team does this specifically. So we build up that, okay, at some point you have to give that away. At what point is it? And you have to get really good at that transition. And it is hard, even for teams that are built that way, that you have to give it away. It's still really hard. You practically have to rip it out of their hands and hand it to somebody else, right?
Yeah, but you have to, because otherwise you just end up with a stack of projects, and you'll quickly run out of bandwidth because you only have so many people in the team to work on all these things, never mind the new stuff. That's true.
Yeah, but you know, if you have a team that's motivated by new shiny things, it's not that hard, you know, to be able to say, okay, you can't do this other thing until you let this thing go. So choose. You want to go move to the maintenance team with it, or you want to keep doing this.
There's precedence in open source, right, where there's you know geniuses, incredibly prolific geniuses, like the guy who did URL lib, right? I mean, he's got 20 projects that eventually they'll go to the Python Software Foundation, right? They'll go to organizations that are there to kind of steward these things with hundreds of people on them, because you don't want these incredibly prolific, creative, and easily distracted people, running your security.
Yeah, so I think the point here is that there needs to be a balance of innovation and maintenance. It's not a this or that. It has to be an and, but we do have to get better at figuring out those transition points and the level of maturity that a project needs at any given time, and how wide it can scale, how fast it can scale based on that level of maturity and security and all of the things that we need to look at.
Yeah.
Deployability, another big one. So
this has been really great. And I think we're, touching the tip of the iceberg into the deeper topic about resilience. All right. And I know on our prep call, we really went deep on this one. And it's a great conversation, because very fundamental to what we're talking about right now is, that fact that you take and you build a shiny object, and now somebody has to really maintain it. If you want it to be something that is accepted and used as a enterprise type piece of software, you have to have that maintainability. But the resilience side, there's a little more to it than that, JC. I know, because when we talked about this in the prep, and I would really like to get into that, because you and what your company does, have some pretty amazing things that should be brought to people's attention.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of smart enterprises that are starting to demand things of their suppliers, whether that's open source or whether those are proprietary capabilities. And if you look at leading institutions like Mayo Clinic, I mean, if you guys want to sell them software, and it doesn't matter, HVAC system, pulse oximeter, chemotherapy infusion pump, doesn't matter. They require active maintenance, right? So all the software components have to be updated within the last year, and those are all your transitive dependencies. And if there's a security issue with them, that has to be remediated within 30 days. And if it isn't, and you still want to use it, you can maintain it. So, people are getting serious about, some of the leading risk indicators that we're looking at, levels of technical debt. I mean, there was a Department of Energy system that, there was an open source component had a critical vulnerability in an update. Update broke the system. Took 3,000 man hours to refactor that system so that the update wouldn't break it, right? That's operational risk. So when we rack and stack these software bills of materials for customers, we're looking at technical debt, active maintenance, supplier and ecosystem risk, single committers, change of control, all of these things that are traditional, like third-party risk management, vendor procurement management type things, are getting applied down on a really granular level so that the customer can understand exactly how much risk they're taking by either using a component or buying from a vendor. And that can affect pricing. It already does in the financial services industry. So there's pricing negotiations now about, what your stack is and how well maintained it is. And so people just, I want to live in a world where, the sales guy's jumping on the dev team to update their dependencies because, he needs to make that sale and get into the right supplier tier because he wants his boat, right? That's the world we all want to live in. And so I think that when software supply chain risk and some of these other leading indicators beyond like the known vulnerabilities become part of the business calculus, and we can automate verification of that because that's what we're doing. That's when everyone starts to get the memo about security because the sales guy wants his boat.
And that's already happening in our world. We, our customers in financial services, they pull out the black duck scan and they've got detailed reports on what we've got in there, and they want the TPLs, third-party libraries, updated before they take the next release. I mean,
we're doing that too for some of the same customers.
The world you just described, I speak to our financial services customers regularly in that world.
Yep. And those are some of our most ardent evangelists is like, yeah, it's winter, especially also for the MSPs too. Winter is coming. And just because you're a SaaS platform or an MSP, you will not escape this kind of, auditing. And
the interesting thing, some of the recent ones I've had was the bits of the product that are in there as, somewhat legacy, although inverted commas, they're not even using them, right? They don't even use them in their use case or the way they use the software. They still come through the black duck scan. They still want them updated. They still want the TPLs removed or updated. And we're like, well, you're not even using that part of the product. I mean, we don't care. It came up in the black duck scan. They've got this process that it's like, they need to get a little more educated on their side, if you ask me. Because
I think that there are measures that are being taken. So I co-run one of the Department of Commerce groups on software transparency and bills of materials. And there's even a special format that's being formulated called a VEX document, a vulnerability exploitability document that says, yes, you are going to find that these libraries have these vulnerabilities according to the NVD, but here's why they are not exploitable in the context of our product. Now, the customer may not believe you. They're probably going to run their own assurance, but at least it's a starting point to say, especially for things like medical devices, when a library actually has been removed, right? You've vendored it. And so the direct dependency is going to flag, but you've actually changed it. So the thing that they're worried about isn't actually even there.
Right.
That's when it becomes really useful. And in terms of assurance, it's all system specific, right? You can't assure software. You can only assure systems because systems have exposures, and something that's good on a developer's laptop on a compartmented network is not good on a web app. So you can't really assure a component, and they know how they're using it. And this just becomes part of the ongoing negotiation between a supplier and a customer. And the more machine readable data you can provide about why this isn't necessarily a risk or it's an acceptable risk, the faster everything's going to go.
You reminded me, JC, when you were saying something. Nelson probably knows what I'm going to say about that, about it running on somebody's computer, but not running on the network, right? You know, the joke, well, it runs on my computer, it runs on my machine. What's wrong with you?
I always say it works as compiled.
Yeah, so I wonder, you know, do a little, and we're going to switch a little gears here in a second, but so, you know, talking about the maintenance side and talking about, you know, the security and that risk side, and I'm sure, especially in industries, finance, healthcare, government, and everything else, there is some massive compliance sides as well that come into play here. So it's not just black duck, you know, you're how do you assure these compliance issues inside something that's an open source developed product?
Mhm.
Yeah, that would be true. I mean, because I mean, a lot of these, you know, going to depend on the data that you're putting through it. In some cases, I mean, it may or may not be an issue, right? But you're going to have personal information. You're going to have issues like data sovereignty. You're going to, I mean, data that can't leave a country's walls, if you will. I mean, there's a number of other considerations, absolutely, when it comes to compliance, regulatory requirements, PII, you know, GDPR, all these things come into play. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, great. Great discussion, by the way, on this one. I'm sure we could go till the end of the session talking about this topic.
Who doesn't love to talk about compliance? I mean, that's what everyone's here to just
I might talk about
all
with you guys.
that wonderful compliance talk.
I don't mind talking
I
about
notice I'm being quiet on that one. Yep.
Yeah, yeah, my bad.
Did someone say disclosure?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the one that threw the grenade into the circle and I'm running away now. All right, well, so I am going to make a shift here, but we have been talking, kind of beating around this a little bit. You know, open source, you know, today has a major impact on how we innovate, and especially in some very, very key areas. And one I want to call out, Michael, is one that obviously you're very familiar with, and obviously Nelson, your team is very active in this as well, is on the impact of innovation around AI and ML. You know, again, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but I'd like to hear more around that, about how open source and AI and ML are starting to come more together.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a point of a collaboration between, you know, Nelson's team and my team, as was the previous stuff that I was talking about. You know, it's one of those things where there's a lot of ethical issues, you know, around, you know, AI usage. But, you know, the ethics is kind of high level stuff. And it's like, you know, someone making a high level, you know, comment about AI systems must be transparent and explainable. It's not really that helpful. It's really, you know, how you build that sort of thing into your actual product. So getting clear guidelines and for design, for software engineers to know they've done a good job, or you know, basically making you should be able to design your AI systems to do what you want them to do, and design out what you don't want them to do. So in that sense, it's just like a standard set of principles for all software design and engineering, you know, that you kind of put those guardrails around things, and you know, you actually make it actionable. So I don't know if that's sort of on the core topic you had, but that's a bit of a hot topic for me. And, you know, we have a guy that actually I'm talking with next week on our at our analytics forum, Ben Schneiderman, who's, you know, he's leading this effort called human-centered AI, where you, you know, put AI, you know, in the hands of folks to use in a way that, you know, protects them, and while giving them, you know, rich, information-rich visualizations and experience and explainability of what's going on, kind of built in. So yeah, I see it's a huge issue, the whole area of you know, AI systems designed for both ethics, privacy, and so on, but also for functionality. And I think that's a really interesting area, because it's bottom line, you got to design your AI systems to do what you want them to do, and put guardrails in, you know, around that.
That's downstream. I mean, upstream, it kind of reminds me of what, you know, in Harry Potter, it says, don't trust something if you can't see where it keeps its brain. So, you know, if you look at the supply chain for these AI/ML capabilities, you know, before you get to your great engineering, there, you know, these things keep their brains in some pretty risky places. And we shouldn't forget that everyone's interested in AI ML, even our adversaries. People who do not have good intentions are very, very interested in AI ML and contribute to it. So we need a very high level of transparency, verification, and assurance of some of these core platform systems and components that we use that think for themselves, because they are not exclusively developed by trustworthy actors. So this is definitely something that we work with our customers in critical infrastructure, because the more of the stuff you use, that sort of the really much more you need escrow, you need transparency. You probably want to think twice about package managers, and because there are risks in the supply chain for some of these foundational components that can be dealt with. You just got to be smart.
Yeah, and I would add in not just the foundational components. One of the bigger issues that I see also is just the data provenance. That, people using public data sets, open data sets. There's some real challenges in the open data sets out there, and the provenance of that data. And we've seen story after story of whole industries where the data is incredibly biased. You've got a whole medical industry that uses predominantly one gender for its data source, and and is ignoring women in its data set almost entirely in the medical industry. And so these are some other challenges we've got to get beyond as an industry. We need explainable AI, absolutely. We also need transparency on our data that we're using to train that and to train those models. And that's a whole nother area that I think we have to look at. And when we're using open data, it should be truly open, and we should understand the provenance of that information.
And to build on what Stacey said, we need that for to understand what the biases are in the data, but then just on a basic level of data integrity, right? Is this actually the data? Right? Because a compromise of integrity, I mean, we focus on compromise of confidentiality, like people's personal information is out, right? That's not the worst thing that can happen.
Yeah.
Some of the worst things that can happen are compromise of integrity. And if the data that you think is true, right, that you've adjusted for the bias and all this other stuff, that data has actually been compromised in some fundamental way, and there's no way to verify it, and you start moving into healthcare, or you start moving into banking and safety and money, no, we really need to think about this and take some steps and be smart about risk management.
Absolutely. I'd recommend that if you haven't seen that movie, Coded Bias. This is Joy Buolamwini from MIT, who had that data set showing racial bias and gender bias, Stacey. I mean, she's really made a big move there, created a whole sort of area of interest in building on the earlier comments. But I think also in these regulatory industries, JC, that you're mentioning, it's kind of like you need transparency and explainability. It's like you can't have like a black box model when you're getting a loan or when you're getting an operation. It's like,
Right.
You kind of have to, and I think the FDA demands this, and some of the financial services oversight. If you're denied a mortgage or a loan or whatever else, you kind of need to understand why as a consumer.
Well, yeah, and then if you're actually, and then I think that probably the FDA will move towards this as well, looking at really ledgering data, right? Not for bias, but just has anybody screwed with this data? And because it's not hard, actually. And so if you have a way to ascertain that, we have the concept of a hash in software, that this is the component. And so, what are we doing with our data? How do we prove that this was the data actually used to motivate this model? And that becomes important, particularly when there are safety implications or financial implications.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, the element of trust, validation, verification, definitely agree. I mean, it's something that people need to address and realize. I mean, how many people have verified some AI ML model that they've downloaded off the internet and then ran it? How many people actually understood what that model did and where it came from? I mean, they might understand I gave it an input and I got an answer, but how? where did it come from?
Yeah,
And so there's a huge element of that. And I agree that the data is, the ability to ledger at least a key element or attribute or hash of that data to make sure no one's messed with it. You have to do the same thing with models. You got to do the same thing with the process that supports both of those.
Yeah. I mean, some of those projects I was talking about earlier, Python libraries and so on, we build those ourselves, but we're also calling the pre-trained models on AWS and Azure as part of the workflows. And I've found great differences between those. I analyzed the data set of Airbnb reviews the other day for a sentiment analysis, and we created our own analysis. And then just for yucks, I ran the pre-trained model from AWS and the pre-trained model from Azure on the Airbnb reviews and got the sentiment back. They disagreed. They absolutely disagreed on, not on every one, but on some, fair number of reviews. They produce different sentiment, and you don't know what they are. They're black box pre-trained models. At least with ours, we do the lemmatization, we do the, what's going on. And sort of in some ways, our hand-built stuff, at least we know what the how it was built.
Yeah, and that wasn't even two providers that are known to be malicious actors.
Right. That's
JC's earlier point, right?
If there's just algorithmic difference
there, the people out there that may not be.
Probably it's a difference in
probably.
Set, probably.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, they're all different spice mixes go into these different platforms, and their differences are to some degree predictable. I think when the differences are not predictable, that's where things get pretty wiggy. But eventually, I mean, even AI ML moves into a different stage of evolution. I mean, I work for 2 AI ML companies, and the whole frontier of causal modeling, right? So when you have directional graphs that'll say, if you push here, this is going to happen there, and here's the math about why. I mean, 5 years, right? That's going to be table stakes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's very exciting. I mean, it's very intellectually challenging, and it's very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's great. And this one, I'm sure, again, another topic we could go on for quite some time on. And we have about 7 minutes left. So I wanted to do a few fun things. One was one of my topics I always included anytime I moderate a session, and that is to give you a chance to talk about, what are your predictions for the future? What are the trends you see coming that are going to be really impactful? And maybe some things that are just starting to trend that you would give advice to the people that are listening. Here's some things to watch out for. I'm no Nelson. I know you have a few off the top of your.
Yeah, I mean, where do you start with that, right? So,
so it's up to you guys. Yeah,
yeah. And I'll just play off of what JC said. I mean, I think going forward, you're going to see either not even just technology, but just the way in which people interact, processes interact, organizations interact, much more highly connected and much more decentralized. I think that is really a large part of what we're going to see, because you can't. You look at all the trends that are out there, the way people are collecting data, using data, executing logic against data, IoT devices. These are just a couple of examples, never mind the stack of technology that we have available in front of us and coming. But these highly connected, decentralized interactions, I think, and the software that subsequently supports those are going to be more prevalent, I think, is what you're going to see. So just to start with that.
It's good.
Yeah, and I'll pile on that. I mean, I agree with the trend of disaggregation. It's something that we're looking at quite a bit on, disaggregated everything. We've got teams that are being spread around. We've got processes being spread around. We've got more things being done closest to the data. And so that's spurring a lot of discussions around, as you move the algorithm to the data, how do you secure those things? As you move the process to the people, how do you make sure that there's accessibility, low latency, all of those sorts of things. I think the other trend that I'm really looking at and believe in is not just open source, but almost open everything. So we're looking at the open science movement that's happening right now. We're looking at, open innovation projects going on. So I do think that, the spirit of open, which is really around collaboration, is going to be a sustained trend. And we're seeing it in the medical industry, partially accelerated by COVID, but we're seeing it just more than that, I mean, it was already started, it's been accelerated, and there are organizations now understanding that I can maintain my differentiation and I can collaborate at the same time. And so that spirit of collaboration through open collaboration, I think is an important trend we should look at, which is why I'm such a big proponent of open source, as I think it's one of the mechanisms to be able to sustain some of those trends that are happening.
I would just amplify that, and also to make a point about the evolution of stocks to flows. So I think people are really used to snapshots. They're really used to, here's the scan, or here's the analysis, or here's the result. When we look at supply chain, and everybody sort of knows this instinctually, there are life cycles, and you can't really understand some of these patterns except in time, right? That they're longitudinal. If something emerges, it becomes very exciting, everyone gloms onto it, and then, you know, folks get bored, they move on to something else. You know, I think Ruby is a pretty good example of that, right? You know, the language, because so you have to understand these patterns in time. And some of the more advanced work we're doing at Ion Channel really has to do with understanding the temporal patterns. Because when you look at issues like end of life in open source, like open source doesn't send you a postcard that says, you know, as of this date, we're not going to be maintaining. I mean, some people are responsible and archive, but most times they don't. And so you have to really understand the time, and open source as a community. I think we all understand the communities are kind of organic living things, and that their vibrancy occurs in time. And you can't just like cryogenically freeze them, right? You have to put, you know, the projects where the people are, and unless you keep that energy going, right, you just have something that can kind of go in a museum and it's not alive. And I think the aliveness of things and the ability to measure kind of what's alive, which is a function of patterns in time, that's our real next level of sophistication in analytics.
Thank you for
sure. I mean, one
yeah,
trend,
Michael, you get the closing. You get the closing.
Okay. Yeah, one trend, I mean, we've been obviously deep into Python and R in terms of our contributions and adoption, and Spark internally in our data science team. But I guess maybe it's because of this Spotfire mods JavaScript extension. I didn't realize like the maturation of JavaScript you know, until I was like, wow, it's like not just, you know, React and Angular and Vue.js, you know, for front-end frameworks or apps, you know, back-end Node.js, there's like, you know, TypeScript. It's like, you know, I'm getting into like this JavaScript world, and I'm like, holy crap. I mean, how's all, did I miss all this? I mean, all of a sudden there's just this massive world there as we're trying to create these extensions to Spotify's visual analytics environment with JavaScript. And, you know, it's kind of blowing my mind. And I did a quick search recently, and JavaScript is actually, you know, neck and neck with Python as the most popular language out there, at least in my world. They've both got massive communities and all these spin-offs into these different flavors and pre-built, you know, templates and things like in TypeScript. So it's like, you know, I've added JavaScript to my, you know, job postings, as it used to be Python, R, you know, Spark, Scala, Java. And yeah, I need to, you know, a couple more JavaScript developers. That's the one big trend. The other big trend I see is just this hyperconvergence in the worlds that I'm in. Like, you know, data scientists who are checking what they're doing DevOps. You know, DevOps people are doing data science. You know, people who used to be writing visual analytics are doing data. I mean, this whole set of worlds of data management, analytics, and DevOps have just merged. And you know, the most unlikely people are, you know, doing stuff in one of those worlds that, you know, they weren't, you know, doing a year ago. So that's those two big trends for me. JavaScript seems to have exploded. Maybe I just have been, you know, checked out of that world. But this other thing of like the collisions and, you know, convergence of all the elements. I guess data science has got such a long flow from problem conception to, you know, data prep and building a model and putting it into production and monitoring it. That's maybe how I'm seeing this convergence and collision, but it is a very real phenomenon in my world, at least.
Oh, well, that's fantastic.
I like that Michael got in there a trend and a recruiting message.
I took it that he was saying he would be willing to be hired as a JavaScript developer.
No. That's such a huge world. I was like, wow.
Well, thank you, everyone. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate everybody's time.